He's the author of a classic anthology in American literature, commonly celebrated in African American studies. It was published the following year under the title The New Negro, an Interpretation. Be reminded that the Harlem Renaissance wasn't originally called the Harlem Renaissance, it was called the New Negro Movement. Why? It was the Negro who was new. She herself was reborn, hence the term Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance, the most famous cultural movement in America that no one can define or explain. Wikipedia currently calls it, quote, an intellectual and cultural revival of African American music, dance, art, fashion, literature, theater, politics, and scholarship, centered in Harlem, Manhattan, New York City, spanning the 1920s and 1930s, end quote. Dictionary.com just calls it, quote, a literary movement in the early 1920s that centered on Harlem and was an early manifestation of black consciousness in the U.S., end quote. Only literary, and now it's an early manifestation, like the birth of something as opposed to the revival of something. I mean, what actually happened? Allow me to answer that question with a bold thesis. The Harlem Renaissance was when the Negro let go of her predominantly indigenous identity to embrace a fully African identity, and the Negro has stolidly embraced this path ever since. It all began with Jessie Fauset, a black Cornell University alumnus. She and County Cullen made names for themselves by applying traditional American literary form to works of fiction built around the black experience. The problem, however, was that she had a tendency to explore primarily the challenges that the ultra-light-skinned subset of the black community encountered when trying to pass or assimilate with Euro-American culture. This angered many of her black contemporaries because they felt like her works advocated for either a disavowal of blackness altogether, or at least an acquiescence to the supposed black inferiority that many whites were still contemplating as real or not real. Here's a profile on Fauset on the LibreText Humanities Library at University of California, Davis. Quote, many of Fauset's works concern the struggles of light-skinned, middle-class African Americans to assimilate and succeed over the limitations of their racial identities, and this largely positive portrayal of assimilation and passing angered other members of the movement like Langston Hughes, who argued for a full embrace of African American racial identity. End quote. So, yeah, she was at odds with some of the titans of culture at the time. This problem already existed by the time of the release party for her novel, There Is Confusion, in March of 1924. The black bourgeoisie devoured her release party with no regard for her book, and they converted it into a who's who of the Negro highbrow at the Civic Club in downtown Manhattan. The New York Times describes it this way, quote, the celebration around her was originally intended to honor that book, There Is Confusion, but Charles S. Johnson and Elaine Locke thought the dinner could serve a larger purpose. What if the two black academic titans invited the best and brightest of the Harlem creative and political scene? Skipping to the next paragraph. What the resulting dinner led to, nurtured over the years in the pristine sitting rooms of brownstones and the buzzing corner booths of jazz clubs, was the Harlem Renaissance, a flowering of intellectual and artistic activity that would give the neighborhood and its residents global renown. End quote. If there's one name mentioned in that missive that should steal the show, it's that of Elaine Locke, the Frasier Crane of 1920s Black Harlem. He's the author of a classic anthology in American literature, commonly celebrated in African American studies. It was published the following year under the title The New Negro, An Interpretation. That book is perhaps as misunderstood as the circumstances surrounding it. Go back to Wikipedia, and you'll be reminded that the Harlem Renaissance wasn't originally called the Harlem Renaissance. It was called the New Negro Movement. Why? It's because the literature's not what was new, nor the music, the art, or the dance. Those were all just the impossibly gorgeous symptoms of a much more frighteningly brilliant virus. It was the Negro who was new. She herself was reborn. Hence the term Renaissance. Literature, music, art, and dance are all just facets of culture, and culture is the cornerstone of ethnic identity. If all those things changed, then black identity changed, and the change became an international spectacle. For the first time, black Americans were willfully identifying as Africans. European colonization, institutional chattel slavery, bloodthirsty Christian proselytism, rabid anti-Semitism, and Western imperialism in the form of manifest destiny and Indian removal all make Negro identity more complex than that of perhaps any ethnic group on the planet. There's no better way to quantify that than to analyze why Negro identity was suddenly pivoting. If it transformed into what we now call African American, what was it before? Let's go all the way back to the slave trade. The Slave Voyages database has an assessments page you can sort to see how many slaves from Africa actually came to mainland North America. Out of 12.5 million slaves taken, 10.7 million survived the voyages to even reach the Americas, but Brazil alone got 4.8 million of them. The Caribbean plus Central and South America received most of the rest. Only 388,747 slaves ever actually disembarked on mainland North America from the beginning of the slave trade to its end in 1865. Yet the 1860 census recorded 4.4 million colored people in the United States by that time. Demographic historians unanimously agree that this requires an almost biologically impossible birth rate for all those people to be Africans. Tracking that birth rate decade to decade shows wild leaps in the population size that can only be explained by something other than birth. These weren't Africans being born, but rather American Indians being gradually added to general population as they lived more and more outside Indian territory. Dr. Robert Finley was a Presbyterian pastor born in 1772, and in 1806 he founded the American Colonization Society, which was a coalition of slave owners and abolitionists who all agreed that black Americans should be freed but relocated to Africa to colonize it themselves, and there extend U.S. imperialism. This is the beginning of the Back to Africa movement. It's that ever-so-brilliant virus I mentioned before, a social contagion hatched from the test tube of reductionist white liberalism. Like most diseases on American soil, it came with the pale face. Other abolitionists at the time actually called out the American Colonization Society as a disingenuous commandeering of the real abolitionist movement to simply find a way to economically benefit from freeing the slave as they had from slavery itself. The idea got no support from black leaders at the time until the federal government passed the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. It gave unprecedented power to any slave owners seeking to recapture fugitive slaves or runaways. That's when black people started considering emigrating to Africa to establish a state that protected their rights. A 2014 article in the Journal of the Early Republic quotes a report from a Negro political convention in New York where the Harlem Renaissance would later begin. The report dates back to the 1850s, and it's talking about Liberia, the American colony in Africa that remains as an independent state to this day. Quote, all kinds of chicanery and stratagem will be employed to allure the people to the African colony, the independence of its inhabitants. The enjoyment and privileges of its citizens will be pictured forth in glowing colors to deceive you. End quote. At that time, first-wave civil rights icon Frederick Douglass owned a newspaper in which he addressed what he called the colonization scheme. Douglas wrote, quote, "There is no sentiment more universally entertained nor more firmly held by the free-colored people of the United States than that this is their own, their native land, and that here, for good or for evil, their destiny is to be wrought out." Identified with the entire history of the American people going back more than 200 years, this sentiment is natural and praiseworthy. There is not now, there never has been, and we think there never will be, any general desire on the part of our people to emigrate from this land to any other, and least of all to the wilds of Africa. End quote. Notice the phrase, identified with the entire history of the American people. Does he just mean U.S. citizens, or does he mean true Americans, the Aborigines? Does he call America their native land because living Negroes then were born here, or because they were indigenous? We might be able to glean his authorial intent by comparing this text to the speech he gave at the Carlisle Indian Institute, wherein he said, quote, "I have been known as a Negro, but I wish to be known here and now as Indian," end quote. Yes, Frederick Douglass himself was Indian on his mother's side, and even partly so on his father's side. These details appear in his 2018 biography, Young Frederick Douglass, The Maryland Years. His father was Euro-Indian, though, so how can he look so much like a black man with no confirmed African blood on either side? It's because Indians were Negroes. Fast forward to the Harlem Renaissance, the literature that most typifies its best-known history comes from the likes of Zora Neale Hurston and Langston Hughes. Langston Hughes became an enemy of Jessie Fauset for touting the white passing path for ultra-light-skinned Negroes. He demanded an embrace of African identity. Ironically, though, his maternal grandmother was reportedly a quarter Indian, and his maternal grandfather was at least a quarter Indian too, making his mother at least a quarter indigenous. From Harlem World magazine, quote, "Hughes's maternal grandmother, Mary Patterson, was of African American, French, English, and Native American descent. One of the first women to attend Oberlin College, she first married Lewis Sheridan Leary, also of mixed race. He joined the men in John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859 and died from his wounds. In 1869, Mary Patterson Leary married again into the elite politically active Langston family. Her second husband was Charles Henry Langston of African American, Native American, and Euro-American ancestry," end quote. Hughes actually owed his career in part to Olivia Ward Bush Banks, a black Montauk Indian staff writer for Colored American, a Boston magazine. She was also a columnist for Westchester Record Courier in New Rochelle, New York, and editor for Citizen magazine. An archived profile on her from Amistad Research Center reports, quote, "Born in 1869 into the immediate post-Civil War era of Reconstruction, her mother was a descendant of the Montauk people, an Algonquian-speaking group, and her father was of Portuguese, East Indian, and African descent," end quote. These are the kinds of black people that made up the upper echelon of educated Negroes who hijacked Jessie Fauset's book release party in 1924, yet they were repositioning their identities on being African. The art was becoming Afrocentric. The Roaring Twenties brought changes to how time was kept in blues and jazz. The Negro wowed the country with the staple musical Shuffle Along, for example, which included the classic hit, I'm Just Wild About Harry.
I'm just wild about Harry, and Harry's wild about me.
Meanwhile, we owe specifically the Delta Blues innovation to Charlie Patton. A Guardian article talks about a 2017 documentary called Rumble, The Indians Who Rocked the World, and it says, quote, "The film attempts to sift out and distinguish every strand of that influence. It traces them back to the beginning of Delta Blues with the artist Charlie Patton. Historians agree that Patton was between a quarter and one-half Choctaw. When the African polyrhythms met the Native American four-on-the-floor beat, that's where you had the blues," said Catherine Bainbridge, film director. "That's the beginning of what we consider modern American music," end quote. While the Negro was reinventing everything, Marcus Garvey was suddenly galvanizing a rejuvenated Back to Africa movement, this time from within the black community. What's really disconcerting about all this is that we can't verify the Africanness of these people, yet we have reason to doubt some of that information. In antebellum America, there was actually a war over the identities of slaves beginning in the 18th century. American Indians were the first slaves, but 388,747 Africans were added to the pot. Then, the enslavement of Indians was suddenly being outlawed in one state after another, which created an economic incentive for slave owners to label all their slaves African, even if most of them were Indian. This also presented the opportunity for slaves to sue for their own freedom. If they could prove they were matrilineally indigenous, they would be freed by a court of law. A Native American genealogy database called the Native Heritage Project has a 2012 article on how this worked for Virginia and Maryland. Quote, in 1705, Indian slavery in Virginia became illegal, but it was not until 1777 that it was decided by the legislature that no Indian brought into Virginia since the Act of 1705, nor their descendants could continue to be held as slaves. Of course, slave owners did not rush right home and free their slaves that they had inherited or purchased. The descendants of the slaves had to find a way to file a lawsuit, and a surprising number did. End quote. If a slave won a suit like this, they likely won their freedom at least partly on the basis of being indigenous. Conversely, losing the suit might just mean they failed to prove they were indigenous, because the obvious defense for the slave owner was to simply argue that no slave was ever Indian, no matter what. The slave might also be clearly Indian, but if there was no proof of descent from an Indian mother, the slave owner might still win the case. The loss of a slave was a waste of a huge financial asset after all, a literal human resource.
Hey y'all! First of all, like and subscribe to the channel, but also, Unahia is recruiting, and if you don't know what Unahia is, we're a grassroots activist group lobbying Congress to amend a bill to require education and research to acknowledge the Negro origins of Aboriginal groups of North America. If any of you have it to give, please support the campaign using the QR code on your screen, join the campaign with a donation, and if you have the time, you can even join our staff to help guide the organization, not just for this campaign, but also future endeavors. Don't speak about it, be about it. Let's go.
Why was it so important to descend from an Indian mother when suing for freedom? Because of the nature of chattel slavery. Partus, Sequitur, Ventrum. It's Latin. It means the child follows the mother. If the mother was free, the child is free. If the mother was a slave, the child is a slave. Therefore, when Indian slavery was outlawed, the mother was entitled to freedom for being an Indian, so her descendants could sue for freedom on the basis of being her descendants, even generations after she was dead. It was just as often that being proven Indian wasn't enough to secure freedom. For instance, the Native Heritage Project cites a court record from Anne Arundel County, Maryland in 1708. The judicial decision reads matter-of-factly, quote, Captive William Harbert presents an Indian youth, the son of an Indian captive woman taken at the Susquehannock Fort, and desires to have the court's opinion whether he be a servant during life as his mother was or not. It is the opinion of ye court that he is a slave during life. End quote. The argument was often the same from slave owners. The first line of defense for their property was to claim the slave was African and thereby force the slave to have to prove they were indigenous. This means lots of slaves were called Africans despite being Aborigines. The most prolific historian on the Aboriginal American experience to this day has been Jack D. Forbes, himself a Lenape Indian. He published a book in 1993 called Africans and Native Americans, The Language of Race and the Evolution of Red-Black Peoples. Page 71 lists several examples of Portuguese Jesuits in the 1500s, referring to all the Indian slaves being taken as Negroes. The reason any black people are called Negro is because of Portuguese influence. Forbes writes this to demonstrate that the word Negro was first used for Indians before being applied to Africans. Quote, thus Negro is used for Indian, not for someone from Africa. The editor suggests that a European copyist might have been responsible for this usage. But as we have seen, it is too consistent over the years to require such an explanation. In any case, it is clear that many Iberians and Italians, whether in Europe or America, were comfortable in using Negro, Negri, etc. for Americans. End quote. Whenever historians unpack the Harlem Renaissance, they rarely include its most important context: paper genocide. Paper genocide was the vector that turned the Back to Africa social contagion into an epidemic of such colossal proportion that the Negro forgot to vaccinate against it, languishing to this day from resurgent outbreaks. Historians have the difficult task of applying the principles of epistemology to the history they study. It's the process of distinguishing between the justified opinions and unjustified opinions of people living in the period of study. In other words, it's about figuring out who was being irrational or reacting to oppression or succumbing to fear in their beliefs. The question historians should ask in that process, apropos of the Harlem Renaissance, should be whether or not there was a pressing reason at the time for the Negro to reinvent her identity. In fact, there was, and Congress has acknowledged that in recent years, without connecting it to the Harlem Renaissance. Democratic Representative Jim Moran of Virginia told the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs in 2008, quote, "It has been called a paper genocide. At a time when the federal government granted Native Americans the right to vote, Virginia's elected officials adopted racial hostile laws targeted at those classes of people who did not fit into the dominant white society. The fact that some of Virginia's ruling elite claimed to be blood descendants of Pocahontas, in their view, meant that no one else in Virginia could make a claim that they were Native American and a descendant of Pocahontas's people. To do so would mean that Virginia's ruling elite were what they decreed all non-whites to be, part of the inferior Negroid race. With great hypocrisy, Virginia's ruling elite pushed policies that culminated with the enactment of the Racial Integrity Act of 1924. This act directed state officials and zealots like Walter Plecker to destroy state and local courthouse records and reclassify in Orwellian fashion all non-whites as colored. It targeted Native Americans with a vengeance, denying Native Americans in Virginia their identity. To call yourself a Native American in Virginia was to risk a jail sentence of up to 1 year. End quote. The Racial Integrity Act of 1924 made it illegal to identify as an American Indian until the Supreme Court overturned it in 1967 with their decision on Loving versus Virginia. The law itself was actually focused on banning interracial marriage, but it delved deeper to erase Aboriginal identity entirely unless it was Euro-Indian. Even then, the Indian part couldn't be greater than 1/16th blood quantum. Why? Because Indian blood was Negro blood, and whites were trying to legislate separation between themselves and the inferior Negroid race, banning both intermarriage and biracial identity between the Euro-American and the Aborigine. The Aborigine was historically considered part of the Negroid race because of how dark they were. The tribes that didn't mix with Euro-Americans even retained their 4C grade hair, a common pre-Columbian American phenotype. This is why Euro-Americans literally went around changing racial classifications on Negro birth records and other documents. Don't forget that the law was passed on March 20th of 1924, exactly 1 day before Jessie Fauset's book launch party. That next night, Elaine Locke and Charles S. Johnson and W.E.B. Du Bois and many other highly educated, politically conscious Negroes got it in their minds that there needed to be a new Negro culture in whom white publishers and producers could invest. Some of those Euro-American connections were in attendance at the dinner. From that night forward, the New York Times recalls that, quote, Locke, Du Bois, and Johnson spent the next year writing letters, raising money, and convincing young artists like the painter Aaron Douglas to come to Harlem. End quote. They weren't launching a book anymore. They were launching a rebrand of the Negro with unprecedented African flair. This led to many of the artistic achievements of what would then be called the New Negro movement, later termed by French Negroes the Harlem Renaissance. A year after Jim Moran made his statement before the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs, the chairman of the committee was Democratic North Dakota Senator Byron Dorgan. He submitted a report in 2009 wherein he explicitly stated, quote, the primary target of the racial integrity law was the African American community, end quote. This statement was even truer than he realized. Even as members of Congress have acknowledged these things, they never seem to realize how broadly the scope of what they're saying actually applies. You can tell even by how he phrased that sentence that he's still viewing this problem through a modern lens. He used the term African American. That New York Times article from earlier also used the term African American, too. That term is a product of the culmination of the new Negro movement long after the fact. It didn't exist at the time. On December 20th of 1988, the Associated Press credited Jessie Jackson with emphasizing a new term being debated in the late 80s. Quote, a group of black leaders, including the Reverend Jessie Jackson, says members of their race would prefer to be called African Americans rather than blacks. End quote. The headline said, leaders say blacks want to be called African Americans. That's extremely recent. That was the year George Bush Sr. beat Michael Dukakis in the general election. This so-called hyphenated identity gradually grew over the course of the 70 years that followed the new Negro movement. Negroes spent those years pivoting to Afrocentrism because the fascination with possible African roots and slave trade studies was considered woke in Alain Locke's day. The racial integrity law was an anti-miscegenation law in Virginia. The reason Harlem was the ideal place for the Negro to be reborn with an identity ideally free of Aboriginal stigma was because it was in New York, one of only 9 states that never had any such laws on the books. In the late 1800s, a wave of 11 states got rid of these laws, but at the time of the Harlem Renaissance, 30 states still had them. So it wasn't just the Jim Crow South, it was more than half the country. We're talking California, Florida, and a lot of what was in between. Many of the movers and shakers were light-skinned Negroes mixed with European ancestry. Locke published his anthology, The New Negro. An introduction, the year after Jessie Fauset's dinner, and the passage of the Racial Integrity Act. It includes works from many authors, but on page 243, he personally writes about African folk tales. Quote, these stories, or their types at least, came with the Negro from Africa where they had existed for centuries. In the African tales, the hare is the notable figure. Surely then the rabbit is none other than the African hare. As a matter of fact, the Brer Rabbit character simply confirms the opinion that Negro folklore is a genuine part of world folk literature. For we find the hare one of the animals most frequently encountered in folklore the world over. End quote. This is a misleading oversimplification, perhaps deliberately, because the truth is that Brer Rabbit's origins are unknown and could just as easily be from any of several Algonquian and Iroquois traditions like those of the Cherokee. Brer Rabbit stories are included among trickster tales, which are commonly debated as either African or Amerindian. Steve Bankhead's 1996 essay in the Watsonville Register said, quote, the African American slaves in that region had known the Cherokees alternately as both masters and fellow slaves, and through intermarriage. Harris heard the Cherokee animal stories, which survived in oral tradition among the slaves, with their own cultural touches. In the 1880s, he began publishing the Uncle Remus stories, with the Tar Wolf tale coming down to us as Brer Rabbit and the Tar Baby. Most of us know these stories from the 1947 Disney film, Song of the South, end quote. Yeah, that's a thing. Two paragraphs prior, Bankhead interestingly observed that, quote, the rabbit was prominent in Cherokee animal stories. Like the Greek god Hermes, the rabbit's speed made it a messenger, but also a trickster and thief. One story tells how the rabbit lost a race to the tortoise. Its close parallel to the Greek fable of Aesop mirrors the similarity of Cherokee origin stories to the Book of Genesis. Add the similar design of Mesoamerican stepped pyramids and the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, and a speculation is born of European and Native American cultures sharing common roots in the region of Asia Minor and the Middle East. They then migrated in opposite paths, meeting much later in America." End quote. How might the Cherokee have Mesopotamian and Middle Eastern connections? Now, we can't help invoke Jewish Indian theory, the colonialist notion that many indigenous Americans were actually descendants of ancient Israel, whose patriarchs trace back to Sumer. The founder of Pennsylvania believed this about them. The Mormons built a whole mythology out of this, but the core idea isn't without merit. Before mixing with Europeans, these were black Asiatic peoples in the Americas. Look at how one historian, Dr. J.O. Dyer, described the Atacapa Indians in 1917. He said they were, quote, "dark-skinned with dirty, short, coarse, black matted hair," end quote. The name Atacapa was an exonym from the Choctaw Indians of Louisiana, but what did the Atacapa call themselves? Eshok, as in Isaac. What about how the Ute Indians are remembered? A 2006 article in the Colorado paper Summit Daily describes their original phenotype as, quote, "surprisingly dark-skinned," end quote. These and several eastern clans of unknown origins may actually have connections to the Na-Dene migration, which was a movement of these dark Asians to America sometime after 1000 BCE. A map illustrating data from the Atlas of Western Prehistory shows that migration within that time frame, and it trails off into spots that lack sufficient data to connect them to specific migrations. All those spots correspond with Indians whose traditions and pre-Columbian phenotype match those of Na-Dene, though, ostensibly including clans from each of the so-called 5 civilized tribes. This aligns with the timeline of Northern Israelite flight from Assyrian captivity due east. Meanwhile, what African heritage did reach North America happens to necessitate a similar consideration. About a quarter of the transatlantic slave trade took from the Igbo nation in what's now known as Nigeria. Even the State of Israel has fixated on the Israelite identity of the Igbo, Yoruba, Lemba, and Ethiopian Jews. All these are African tribes from whom the slave trade took captives. Jews who scoff at this are usually just unaware that their own scholars are the ones who researched and validated this information. Even if you believe none of these crazy theories, that's not the point. The point is that the Negro was uniquely, forcibly displaced, enslaved by Native Americans and all Europeans, including Jews. If blacks are wrong and they offend you by thinking they're you have only yourself to blame for the confusion. Had you left the Negro wherever she was, whether it be America or Africa or Venus, she would remember herself. This is why I say Negro identity is more complex than that of just about any other ethnic identity on the planet. Period. The Harlem Renaissance was a deliberate, reductionist reinvention of Negro identity to escape the vitriol of Euro-American prejudices toward the allegedly savage Indian.
There is a new museum in Charleston, South Carolina, dedicated to hundreds of years of African-American history. It's Black history in global context and through individual stories, too. Now, to show off the expanse and resonance of the museum's Center for Family History, researchers traced my genealogy. Now listen, as a Black man with deep roots in the American South, I thought I knew where my story was headed. I was very wrong.
Very few moments in my career have ever brought me to this.
This is, oh, man.
That's the museum's top genealogist, Dr. Shelley Murphy, on the laptop. She's joining us from the University of Virginia. David Vennie, my great-grandfather's great-grandfather. He lived in coastal Richmond County, Virginia, on a farm with his wife Judy and their 18 children. And in 1871, he filed this claim to be reimbursed for livestock and supplies requisitioned by Union troops during the Civil War.
Another thing that is significant is that he owned the land that he's on, and it was 23 acres.
Where did a man in the 1870s, so soon after the end of slavery, get the money to buy 23 acres?
Absolutely. And the thing of it is, I would even question, he said he was freeborn.
Well, for some answers, we have to go back more than 300 years to my great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother, Mary. She arrived on a ship in Northumberland County, Virginia in 1712, before America was America. Her granddaughter, my 8 times great-grandmother, Bess, was with her. That's according to this centuries-old deposition that Dr. Murphy's team uncovered. Why a deposition? We'll learn that a little later.
And Bess at the time was about 13 years old. Witnesses apparently said they looked like they were Indians.
Researchers believe that Mary and Bess were actually Matabani, like these people of that region of Virginia called the Northern Neck. Mary and Bess were actually Matabani. And it's Sarah, my 7 times great-grandmother, who changes the trajectory of her children and all her descendants who followed.
There was a law back in 1705 that declared that all children that are enslaved or free, their condition would be based on whatever their mother was.
Remember, Sarah and Bess arrived free people.
So Sarah has a lawsuit that's filed saying, we're free.
This is the actual lawsuit filed by Sarah, suing for her freedom and for the freedom of her descendants. And that deposition, it was from a witness who saw Mary and Bess arrive decades earlier.
So in 1791, the court agreed with Sarah and her children, the grandchildren, and all of those relatives who were descendants of Mary and Bess are going to be free.
It fills in a lot of gray, a lot of blank space. There was nothing there. There was an assumption.